We began last week by talking about some of the theoretical approaches that cultural anthropologists have taken to study humans and food, or food in cultures. Today, let's turn to talking about some of the ethnographic methods that are used. Cultural anthropologists do ethnography, but other professions have also adopted ethnographic methods. So cultural anthropologists study culture and people's beliefs, practices, and the cognitive and social organization of human groups. In other words, they study how people who share a common cultural system organize and shape the physical and social world around them, and are in turn shaped by those ideas, behaviors, and physical environments. So what is culture? Well, a very simple answer would be the knowledge that people use to live their lives and the way in which they do so. A bit more formal way would be to say it's the values, beliefs, attitudes, and practices accepted by members of a group or community. Culture is learned through socialization and language acquisition. What is ethnography? Well, according to Fetterman, it's the art and science of describing a group or culture. Somewhat like an investigative reporter, but instead of trying to write about the unusual, the ethnographer writes about the routine daily life, focusing on predictable patterns of thought and behavior. The ethnographer tries to understand and describe a social and cultural scene from an emic, or inside, point of view. So emic refers to an insider's point of view. Etic refers to an outsider's point of view. So even within your own culture, you could be emic in some aspects. For example, I am a part of the group of archaeologists or the group of paleoethnobotanists, but I would be an outsider if I were to be an ethnographer studying, say, RVers. Two prominent cognitive theories have been used to talk about individual and cultural knowledge. These are the cultural consensus theory and the cultural schema theory. The cultural consensus theory assumes that culture exists in the minds of the members of the culture, but that there is variability among individuals in how much they actually know about the various aspects of the culture. So cultural consensus assumes that there is a socially transmitted pool of cultural information, and it tries to figure out what do people within the culture agree should be the answer to any particular issue or question or action. And it uses statistics to figure out the pattern of agreement or consensus. Schema theory speaks to how information is stored cognitively. It says that past experience provides a conceptual model, one that is a network of information. And in looking at cultural knowledge, it's built of shared experiences among multiple people. But the schema may situationally change. The ethnographer's most important data gathering technique is the interview, which requires verbal interaction. So an interview is not the same as a questionnaire that you send out to someone. In an interview, you sit down face to face with someone and talk to them. There's more than one type of interview, and each type complements the others. I'll talk first about informal or unstructured interviewing, which seems to be casual conversation. The questions emerge from the conversation, although in the back of your mind, you, the interviewer, have a clear plan of what you would like to learn. You must be attentive to the informant's attitudes and feelings. This type of interview is especially good in the early stages of a project to get acquainted with the people that you'll be interviewing and to build some rapport. A structured interview is a verbal questionnaire with explicit research goals. So you actually have a list of questions that you're going to ask everyone. This type of interview tends to shape responses to conform to the researcher's conceptions. So it's most useful for collecting data about specific questions or to address a specific hypothesis, or when you already understand the emic point of view. What's nice about this type of interview is that because you've asked the same question of everyone, you can use it to do quantitative statistical analysis. The third type of interview is open-ended or semi-structured, where you have your list of structured questions and topics to cover, but you also elicit extensive responses and are willing to take side trips as things arise from your interviewee talking back to you. So you have some questions prepared in advance, but some arise naturally during the interview. As anyone knows who's taken tests, there's many different types of questions. You could ask direct questions such as what, when, who, why, and how, or closed types of questions that just require a yes or a no, open-ended. Fill in the blank, multiple choice. You could ask people to rank things like what's your favorite breakfast food, what's your second favorite, or dichotomous, where you say either or. Now, in recording responses, you as the interviewer or ethnographer should be careful in distinguishing between the literal answer that the person gave, and it's always good to take down quotations, versus your observations. For example, maybe they made a motion that would switch the entire meaning of their answer, so maybe they rolled their eyes, and so you realize that they didn't mean what the words sound like. They meant something else. And then your interpretations. So it's always good to distinguish, is this a literal answer? Is this your observation? Is this your interpretation? Another question or issue that you face as an interviewer is how to phrase the question so that you don't lead the interview. This is a real skill to develop. For example, rather than saying, what is the name of this dish? Now, how does that lead the interview? Well, it assumes that the dish has a name. Instead, why don't you say, does this dish have a name? Also, any question must be formulated in a culturally meaningful and appropriate way. That is, you need to find the correct question to ask and how to express the question. The cultural anthropologist's signature data collection technique is participant observation. In participant observation, you live and participate in the lives of people, but you maintain some professional distance that allows observation and recording of data. So you live among the people. Perhaps you have your family with you, which is always an icebreaker to have children with you, your own children. And later, at the end of the day, you sit and write notes about what you observed and heard that day. So you're really kind of out of sight when you're recording that. And yet, as you'll see later on, you do have to inform people that you are observing them. You can't do it in secret. Participant observation is either continuous, say for 6 months or more, or non-continuous. Maybe if you're trying to get at things that occur seasonally, you come in a few weeks every couple of months over several years. Van Daly, your reading for today, was in the field for 10 months. Let's talk about some other data collection techniques, just a few. One is simulation, where you ask people to reenact activities. Again, let's say that you're interested in all the different annual festivals that go on, but you're not there at the right time of year to see one. You might ask people to reenact that particular feast or occasion. These days, we also ask people to self-report, to keep their own diary, or we give them a disposable camera and ask them to take photographs. And also focus groups. Instead of interviewing one-on-one, one person privately, sometimes it works out very well, with everybody's permission, to interview a group so that there's some back and forth among the group members of agreement and disagreement about the answers. So you get the interaction. Anthropologists adhere to a professional code of ethics. Ours is through the American Association of Anthropology. This states that we must be truthful in our research goals. In other words, unlike some other disciplines, like I think psychology and sociology, we can't mislead people. We have to be very upfront. Here is what we are trying to do. We must obtain informed consent. And among anthropologists, this can be either written informed consent, or because many of the people we work with either don't write or are distrustful of written documents, we are allowed to get oral informed consent. And we have protocols to establish that we've done so. Additionally, for many years now, we ask people whether they want their name used or not. In past years, anthropologists would make the names anonymous. They would make up names and say, here, I went to the town of Middleton and here's what I saw. And what happened was that people from that town knew that you were doing that work, and they knew you were writing a book, and they were eagerly looking forward to seeing the book and their names in it. And out it came, and all their names had been changed. And they said, why didn't you use my name? So we realized that we should simply ask people, do you want us to use your name, or do you want us to use a pseudonym? Various other specialties or subfields within anthropology belong to professional organizations that additionally have codes of ethics. For example, I belong to the International Society of Ethnobiology, which has another code of ethics. Just about every profession has a code of ethics. So hopefully you've, for whatever major you are, you've learned about the code of ethics that are germane to your major. So ethnographers are conducting what's called human subject research. They're recording information about and from people. To do so, you must first undergo training for being ethical in your human subject research. Here at the University of South Carolina, you as a student can take a free 5-hour online CITI certification, which is a national professional level certification good for 3 years. 3 years from now, you would need to renew it to keep your certification. And of course, this is available through our Office of Research Compliance. So let's say that you've become certified for conducting human subject research. You know about your society's code of ethics, you have some methodology, you have a research question. Before you're allowed to go out in the field and begin interviewing people, you must apply to the Institutional Review Board at your institution, your IRB, as it's called, at USC, for permission to conduct research involving humans. So these are safeguards put in place to make sure that you are conducting ethical human research. And here at University of South Carolina, we have 3 different levels of permission. Exempt, which is when the research that you're doing has none or very little likelihood of any harm to the people that you're working with. In that, you can get permission back sometimes within 24 hours to conduct that type of research. Or expedited, where the amount of harm might be low, or let's say that you're asking to interview a population at danger, at risk, and so it needs a little more thought, such as interviewing children or interviewing people at an old folks home or interviewing prisoners. So they want to make sure that all the protocols have been met to get fully informed consent. Versus something that is more tricky, say you're going to be asking questions about their medical conditions or drawing blood, you would have to go through full review, which could take several months. You'd have to wait till the review board met, which they only meet several times a year. So formally in this class, we did an ethnographic project. We went out and we had a project that all of us worked on. Through the years, these have been a number of different projects. We spent many years asking people what is a vegetable. We also researched what is a snack, and most recently, what is a condiment. But with the pandemic, we're not going to be doing face-to-face interviews. But I did go through the IRB and get permission for our class project each time. so that potentially you, the student, or I, the teacher, could go to a conference, for example, and give a paper on that. And we couldn't do that without having passed through human subject research, the IRB review. So, however, I do still want you to obtain your national level certification for conducting human subject research. This is something that would be a real coup for you to have as an undergraduate on your resume. It's going to make you stand out. And this is due a month from now, October 7th. This is an online course that can take 5 hours to complete. It has 15 modules. It's free because you are a student here at the University of South Carolina. So it does not cost you several $100s. Each module has a quiz, and you must score 80% or higher to be certified or to get your credit for this assignment. So you read what they assign you to read, and initially it's quite a lot of reading. As you go through, it gets less and less reading. Then you have a very short quiz. You take the quiz. You don't need to complete all the modules in one sitting, so maybe you'll do one module and come back 2 days later, do another module. However, if you got a bad quiz score, do not log out. Immediately retake that quiz, and maybe a question will change or the order of the answers will change, but continue taking that quiz until you get 100% on your score. Then you can log out and come back and do some more later. But as I said, initially the reading is a long reading. The quiz questions, I think, are a little bit tricky. They're not super direct or easy necessarily to apply. But then the questions start repeating themselves and the readings get shorter. So as you go along, it gets easier and easier. So here you are. You're going to be doing ethnography. You have a research goal. You have some methodology. You've completed your certification for doing human subject research. You have your permission from the IRB board to conduct that research. But you can't interview everyone. I couldn't interview everyone in South Carolina, for example. It's just simply not possible. I can't afford it, for one thing. So how can you sample who to interview? How can you choose who and what to study? There are two basic approaches to sampling. One is non-probabilistic, also called non-arbitrary. And the other is probabilistic sampling, also called arbitrary. And I'll start with that. So in probabilistic or arbitrary sampling, you select subjects based on formal statistical criteria. So there's no inherent natural or cultural relevance to who you choose to talk to, somewhat. This type of sampling has the best chance of being representative of the entire population. And it allows you to evaluate how representative your sample is with respect to the entire population. There are three methods to probabilistic sampling: simple, random, systematic, and stratified. In simple random sampling, each subject has a statistically equal chance for selection. This is a type of sampling strategy that you could use when you're recording general knowledge. However, it would not be good for recording specialist knowledge. How do you do it? Well, you would label subjects with numbers, determine what sample size you can afford to look at. In my examples here, I have a population of 100, and I have enough time, and time is money, to talk to 10% of them. And then you select your required number of subjects by random. You could use a table of random numbers. You could pull numbers out of a hat. You could flip coins for yes, no. So here's an example of 100 people that I've labeled, and what came up randomly were these. So you can see that they have no particular pattern to which of the people I might interview. The second type is called systematic sampling. And on this one, like always, you set your sample size. I'll stick with 10% again. The first subject is selected by random, but then the rest of the subject are selected at predetermined equal, that is, systematic intervals from the first, hence the name systematic sampling. So since I'm looking at 10%, it will be every 10th person from the one that was selected by random. So here, for example, are my 100 people that I've numbered. Randomly chose number 23. Now I just count out 23 plus 10. And then I also go backwards from there. So 23 minus 10, 23 minus 20. And I end up with the 10 people that I want to sample. Now immediately you'll notice a potential problem with systematic sampling. What if the data have the same kind of distribution? Here, for example, I chose a 50% sample at an apartment complex. I was interested in talking to inhabitants of an apartment, and you can see that I missed the inhabitants who lived in the biggest apartment of all. So the type of sampling strategy that I prefer is called stratified sampling, where you divide your research universe into large types of subjects that differ by some variable. For example, men versus women. Then you choose either random or systematic sampling, whichever one, you got to stick to it. And then you sample using that random or systematic within each type of subject. So for example, I would make sure then that I was talking to both men and women. Or if I'm looking at the major religious beliefs within my small town, that I talk to each of those. Or maybe different people who had different philosophies about what to eat, I would talk to each of those. Here's an example coming back to the apartment complex. I could divide into the big unit, the central unit, or the end unit in the apartment blocks and make sure that I sampled families from each of the different room types. Moving on to non-probabilistic or non-arbitrary sampling methods, one of those is purposive or judgmental sample, where you simply make a judgment about what is typical in the population and strive to talk to those people. A quota sample is where you target who to be included, so the interviewer is given a quota to meet. I've done that in past years in a class where we were interviewing people here in different Columbia neighborhoods about their vegetable gardens. And each team of students, each pair of students, was given 2 streets, and they were to find 2 different people to interview. So that gave me kind of a geographic spread across the neighborhood. A genealogy-based sample kind of tells you you're looking perhaps for different members of that family. Chain or snowball sampling, where you ask each interviewee for other members of the target group. This is a frequent sampling technique when you are interviewing specialists. So let's say that I knew of 2 really good herbalists, and when I interviewed them, I say, who else do you know who is also a really good herbalist? And so by asking each person, I would find yet another person to interview who was a specialist. Or match samples, where you compare 2 subgroups alike in some way. So maybe an example of that would be comparing men to women. Or kids at a private school versus kids at a public school. So there are a number of parts to an ethnographic project, and they don't all run sequentially. You're often doing some of these parts simultaneously. So planning and design, formulating research questions, formulating strategies and methodologies, deciding on how you're going to sample, obtaining permissions, making up the kind of forms that you're going to use or computer programs you're going to use. And of course, you need to have done background research. You will be conducting fieldwork, whether that's a participant observation and you're going out for 10 months or a year. You're going to also be doing data analysis. And then at the end, you'll be presenting your findings, including outlining or detailing your methodology so that other people could replicate your study if they wanted to. When you're going out to begin an ethnography, you want to begin with an open mind about the group or culture, but enter the field with a theory or a theoretical approach, a model, a research design, a problem, data collection techniques, tools for analysis. Anthropologists used to go out and say, here's what I want to know, and strive to learn that. What they learned, though, was that sometimes in those initial interviews with people, the unstructured interviews, they found out that the question that the anthropologist wanted to ask wasn't really an important question to the people themselves. And if you listened, they actually said, here's what is really interesting and we think you should study instead. And so the anthropologist who listens will change their research problem to what the people themselves said, here is what the interesting question is. All ethnographers, all scientists have biases. All we could do is try to make them explicit. So science is never neutral. We all filter the questions that we ask and how we ask them, and even how we interpret them through our culture and our experiences. It's simply by trying to realize that you do so, you can help to take away some of the effects of that kind of bias. What ethnographic methods have been used in the studies we've read so far? Van Daly, your reading for today, talks about his research in Sri Lanka. He conducted participant observation. He tells us he was in the field for 10 months. However, he doesn't really talk about his out-of-house research in this paper. And instead, what he talks about is, it's really kind of an ironic, that here he is studying food and cooking and the problems that he personally had in obtaining food for himself to eat while he was doing this work. He spent 10 months in a Sinhalese village studying food production and consumption. And his approach was food as a methodology and as a subject. He looked at the ways food shapes life among activists in Colombo, as well as among farming villagers throughout their everyday and ritual life. I thought you might enjoy seeing some pictures of Sri Lanka. They do have extensive tea plantations and incredible vegetable markets or produce markets, fresh produce. Yeah, let's go there. And I thought you might find it fun to come back to this page and read up on some of their dishes. You've also already read Blake and others, Classifying Foods in Contexts. Blake, Christine Blake here at the University of South Carolina, is a nutritionist, and yet she uses ethnographic methods extensively. And she gives very detailed methodology. In this particular study, they had purposive sample by recruiting. So they wanted adults in non-managerial, non-professional occupations. Although within that subset, they selected to vary in age, anywhere from age 20 to 62, gender, and living situation. And this project was part of a larger project investigating situational eating. They conducted multiple in-depth interviews. They tape recorded them and they transcribed them verbatim. The interviewers then established rapport with the participants because they had multiple contexts within the context, multiple contacts within the context of the larger study. So a lot of time invested in the people that they spoke with. One of the techniques they used is what's called a card sort of 59 foods. And a card sort is where you have like index size cards. I like to laminate mine. And if it's a society who has a written language, you can simply have a word written on it. Otherwise, you would have a picture on the card. But they tell us how they developed which cards, which 59 foods to have on the cards. And they had their subjects do 4 successive card sorts in conjunction with open-ended questions. And so just that one part of the interview took 2 hours. So it was a lot of time invested, not just for Blake and her workers, but also for the people who agreed to be subjects. They presented their preliminary analysis and interpretations in a follow-up interview after the card sort, which I think is a very ethical and wonderful thing to do, to get people's feedback saying, are we getting it right? What do you think? And getting their feedback on the work that they, as ethnographers, were doing. Most recently, you've read Joosse and Marshall, Fridge Stories, a methodological toolbox for getting closer to everyday food practices. Here they talk about 4 main tools in their toolbox at trying to get at practice, or how people actually behave day to day. And one of those was Fridge Stories, where the subject talks about what is in the refrigerator. Food mapping, where you ask the subject to mark their paths to food on a map. Shop along, where you accompany the person as they shop. And food diaries, where you ask them to record their daily consumption. Now, these methods speak to trying to get at practice, but they also speak to different places, or they remind me that interviews can take place at different places. So, for instance, oftentimes interviews are at a place where the action didn't occur. So they're meeting in your office, or you're meeting in their home, but they're talking about something that happened somewhere else. Versus what's called a field interview, where you actually interview where the action occurs. So if you're interviewing, for example, a farrier, you're not just sitting down in his living room talking about what he does, but you're out there at the stable with the horse while the farrier's working. For example, their shop along was a type of field interview. And these methods also speak to how you can jog or contextualize responses. So, for example, you could show an object like a food dish or the refrigerator contents and use the object to spark conversation. I've seen this done in ethnobotanical ethnography, where you show somebody a basket, and then that leads to talking about what materials are used to make it, where do you get those materials, how do you manage the materials and harvest, what sort of dyes were used, how did you make them, where did you get the shape, where did you get the design. There's a lot of things that you could learn from just talking about the object. Coming up, you'll be reading Meigs, 1997, Food as a Cultural Construction, an extremely interesting article about how people think about food traditionally in Papua New Guinea. In a footnote to the article, she says that most of the rules she states came from just 2 men, but they were corroborated by 11 other hua, mostly men. So it sounds, even though she didn't really talk about her methodology, it sounds as though her sampling was non-arbitrary. So I'd like, as you read further articles for this class, to pay attention to the methodology and be thinking about it. You know, if you're going on yourself to study nutrition or food, what do these sound useful to you that you might end up using in your professional career? And I'll leave you now with 2 slides showing the major sources for this PowerPoint.